Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book, a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how it would played. I am your host, Max, and joining me is my co-host, Troy. Working behind the scenes, as always, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about dice and things, which is to say, the components of games, the math rocks, chaos cubes, luck pebbles, and all those other things that go bump on the table.
Exactly.
What's your feeling about the mechanical component? I know that's like a super vague question, but let's go with that.
Well, I mean, it really helps settle in a game depending on your components. For a lot of board games, the components are the game in many regards. But for things like miniatures games, you tend to think of miniatures as separate from the components in many respects. They're one category of item, and then our little tokens that track our wounds and our status effects, they're a different type of item, and then our dice, yet again, are something else. But having fancy, cool thematic dice feels good sometimes. Having nice models is great, and these tokens and counters can be really useful in a variety of games. And having more than just a ripped piece of paper to write a wound stat on, can be nice.
So, how much component do you like at your table if you're playing, say, not in a VTT or something like that?
I don't mind stuff on my table. I know there is a lot of people who like to play a miniatures game with no clutter because it takes away from the visual appeal, which I totally understand. But I've used tokens really effectively, and to give some context, I used to play the miniatures game Star Wars Legion by Fantasy Flight Games. I've kind of fallen out of playing it in recent time, but I've preserved all of the components because they're some of the best miniature game components I've ever seen. And I use them for every indie miniatures game I play because they'll have we'll put a guy on Overwatch. And I don't have an Overwatch marker for that game, but I have a really high quality component from Legion I'm sure would work. And I just use it as my toolbox. And I do a lot of token use because it really helps a solo player who doesn't have another mind at the table to remember status effects or remember what their army's doing. If you're doing the whole table, those tokens can be valuable.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I think you do more solo wargaming than I do, but I can definitely see having those being less of a hindrance. And in my own opinion, I'm more of a minimalist when it comes to a lot of things. I'm not a dice goblin. I'm sometimes a bit of a hoarder when it comes to dice, but I don't have nearly as many or wide variety of components as a lot of people that I know who just collect them for the sake of collecting.
Yes.
I have a personal pet peeve of the texture and coloring of a dice making the dice hard to read, and I just don't want to use them. I prefer to use opaque with clear numbering and not a lot of excessive detail. Sometimes a little bit of marbling is okay if it doesn't distract too much, but I'm just a big fan of plain opaque dice. And I don't tend to gravitate toward games that use a lot of dice, with the exception of Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Yes.
Which by its nature makes me use a bunch of dice that don't exist in other games. My general preference is to play games that I want to say I have a tendency to efficiency. I know that sounds pretentious, but one of my favorite games so far is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition, because it only uses 2d10s, either as a 10 roll or as a d100 roll. But one of the other nice things is that the main mechanic for executing on something is done with one roll. You see that it beats the target number. Then you reverse the digits to determine the hit location. And then the number of tens digits above the target number is the number of success. So one roll, 3 things. It's beautiful, clean, and it puts a lot more focus on that one roll, which I think is good. Whereas it doesn't take me completely out of the game, but if I'm roll a d20, cool. And okay, now what's my weapon damage? Okay, I'll grab that. And I'll probably have taken a set of those dice out specifically, but it's just one more step. And it's funny, there's a similar argument that I've made that I remember hearing when I was in game design school, or when we were in game design school. Hey, everybody, we went to school together. And that was the idea that, does the Wiimote make the game more immersive? And I can't remember what instructor we had at the time, but he made a very compelling argument about why it isn't. Because if you're using a controller, you're putting in like minimal gestural movements. And eventually, you're not thinking about what your hands are doing. You're just looking at the screen. That your hands are gone and your gestures when you learn the controls better and better, it gets easier.
Yeah.
But if you're like actually waving your arms around to wave a sword, the artifice of the controller in your hand and seeing it mirrored onto the screen for me, it causes this massive disconnect.
Yeah.
I'm like, I feel like I'm waving around a magic wand that makes something happen in the game. And I'm not to say that there aren't games that worked fairly well. I like Wii Golf. That's fun.
Yeah. The bowling was fun.
Bowling is fun. It kind of plays itself a little bit, but still good. But yeah, I feel the same way about dice systems, personally.
Mm-hmm.
I like games that have a good floor to ceiling range. I think D20 is definitely the sweet spot, though I do prefer D100 games or percentile systems. I don't think that extra level of granularity is super necessary, but it's nice. It's fine. It adds a little bit of variability into the game.
Yeah, instead of playing with 5% chunks, you can step all the way down to 1% and really feel a minor difference.
Yeah, but I've also enjoyed things like White Wolf games that use D10 pools and other pool systems. I'm a big fan of the Free League Alien game, which uses D6s.
Oh, yes.
You know, I think for me, it's more about the feel and what the interesting variety results. I don't think there's any one system that works better than any other, but for me personally, I like having a kind of elegant simplicity as the goal. It's never 100% that, and there's always things that you give up for doing it. But yeah, novel types of dice and like using the whole range, with the exception of DCC, which has a mechanical argument for it, that being the dice chain.
Yes.
I think that's what sold me on the idea of using a whole bunch of different dice. There's some math around the dice chain that's a little wonky, but it doesn't matter because the game is just throw down fun.
Wait, it's not balanced?
Yeah. What?
Throw it out the window.
Balance is an overrated virtue in role-playing games.
In all tabletop games, in my opinion, too. But
it's a good goal, but I don't think you should break yourself on it being balanced, because there's been a lot of attempts at balance where it takes the texture out of the game.
Dude, I do quarterly balance updates where I invalidate all in-print books. So you deal with that. But for me, like some of the dice I love is we talked about it last episode, but Picto dice, like Star Wars and Legend of the Five Rings and Genesys, and other games too. I got a, what's the one with plus and minuses?
Oh, Fate
dice, right? Thank you.
Yep.
So there's lots of dice that have symbols that have different meanings you can interpret from them. As I disclosed last time, I love Legend of the Five Ring and its dice systems, and I've had some great Star Wars campaigns as well using the Edge of the Empire book and those dice.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I've had outcomes that you couldn't have had on a pass fail.
Yeah,
and it's like the ability to pass a check but roll a critical failure with a disadvantage allows you to like achieve something at great cost. And you can always do that in your role play. You don't like rulings can always supersede rules, right?
Yeah.
But it's really cool when the fundamental way you interact with a system is designed to produce these awesome results. Like I had an L5R fight where it was like a bandit was robbing like fruit from a cart vendor, and I like stood up to him, and it turned into a fist fight. And I actually didn't win the fight, but I had enough opportunity to not lose face. So the bandits left anyways. You know what I mean? Like I took the punch with like, I stoically took his punch and was like, do you want to start this with me?
Yeah.
And then the guy's like, okay, I'm out of here. And it was kind of like, it played very differently than just like, I took 6 damage. Okay, well, I guess it's my turn to strike him now. You know what I mean? Like there was just that extra bit of flavor that provided that context that I really liked. And that's why those picture dice can be some of my favorite ways to chance cube it up.
No, totally. I'm a big fan or a big proponent of variable success.
Yes.
I don't just want to know pass fail. I like to know by what degree, even when it's not necessary, just for storytelling, like just as a nice prompt. But yeah, you're right. Like Picto dice, especially using the Genesys system, The downside is it can be a little hard to read them, like read the result.
That's so true. Like, and even when you know how to read the results, sometimes fitting, like, okay, I have 3 advantages on this roll. I have 2 success, 3 advantage. I spend my 2 success on hitting the guy with my blaster and doing +1 damage. And now I have 3 advantage. Like, what am I doing with this? Okay, I knock him over. I hop the piece of cover I'm on, and I spot a door panel that I can blast to open it up to come up with a new escape route. Cool.
Right.
But you kind of, like, I've done this a million times, so I'm able to put those together. But like, when you're trying to mesh all this together, it can take moments of time that a simpler dice outcome you'd already be way past it. You'd be onto your next dice roll.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I guess we can get down to the idea of, like, you know, what are dice made? I mean, okay, so dice, obviously, if you hadn't noticed, have existed for, like, probably one of the oldest gaming materials that exist.
Yeah, for sure.
Famously, they're made out of knuckle bones, which is where the term rolling bones comes from.
Yep.
But they, you know, wood, ivory, clay. I'm a little suspicious of clay dice because they're probably molded by hand, but, you know, molds exist. But yeah, and then obviously with modern gaming, plastic dice. And then there's, you know, you have your standard 6-sided die. That's pretty common. And, you know, I remember hearing a funny argument where, like, the one advantage to back in the day of playing a game that, like a role-playing game that uses 6-sided dice, or a war game that uses 6-sided dice, is that no one you could be playing Monopoly. No one will know. Because it's so ubiquitous. There were games, like in the 70s, that's when, I mean, I don't know the exact history of how multi-sided dice, like, okay, in all fairness, like, there were 20-sided dice in Egypt. I don't know if you could call them dice in the normal sense, because they probably had some other sort of significant value, but they had D20s. And there's probably been other...
That's remarkable.
Yeah, right? And there probably been other shapes, especially platonic solids, which is when you see the first polyhedral beyond 6 sides start showing up. But in the 70s, Lou Zacci, he didn't pioneer the creation of those dice as much as he helped people get a hold of them and distribute them and made them available to people. I think they were being manufactured in somewhere in East Asia. I want to say Taiwan, but I could be wrong about that. And they were made of a particular plastic quality. I know one of my ancient grognard buddies tells me about, like, how those dice were almost spongy in their quality. Like, they weren't hard plastic the way we think of them now. And they didn't come with numbers. You had to put the numbers on yourself.
That's old school.
Right? And then eventually they became conventional enough that they ended up in some war games. And then Dungeons and Dragons made massive use of those. And then subsequently the other games, you know, created the role-playing boom of the 70s and 80s. And one of the one that I always thought is interesting, I didn't know this until starting to look into this, and I've mentioned this has come up in other episodes, I think the Call of Cthulhu episode, is the D10.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not a regular platonic solid. Because it's technically, the one face is like a kite shape, so it's sort of like an irregular square. But that was like a new invention at one point, and it was like the cool kid dice for the longest time. Yeah. This is why, like, so many games through the early 90s are using D10s, which is weird because I think D10s came out in, like, the 80s, around when it's strange because Call of Cthulhu uses that system that we were talking about in that episode where you roll 2 D20s that only go up to 10. Yeah, again, much more DIY kind of environment. But my experience with the game and with D100s is, I would have assumed they would have come up with the percentile system with those dice. But those dice actually didn't exist when that idea came up.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's kind of counterintuitive in a weird way.
But yeah, the biggest, like, push for the D10 being used was probably White Wolf. But a whole bunch of other games, as from last episode, before the 5th edition FFG of L5R, that is a D10 based game. I don't know if you go all the way back, it might overlap with Dungeons and Dragons because there's a parallel there.
Yeah.
But for most editions, it's a D10 game, and you can tell it's taking those cues from those White Wolf games. That's dice in a nutshell. And yeah, now they come in every color and material. You've got some that glow on the inside. They've got like liquid centers, and
there's metal ones that are like
glitter
crazy.
and crap all over them. And you can tell how much I love that. Yeah, there's metal ones that, like, word to the wise, do not bounce metal dice on a glass table. It won't break it, but those dice are going somewhere. I mean, any dice on a glass table is generally a bad idea.
I had a really cool dice tray I was using at Darren's place that was just like a really old, elaborate ashtray.
Oh, dear.
And rolling dice, and it was so fun because they would launch and they would just like fly across the room. It was so good.
Felt your containers, people.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You won't keep your dice for long if they're flying all over the room.
But the next thing I want to talk about is kind of my jam. This would be miniatures.
Oh, yeah.
So this is where you take a dude that represents a dude. They're common in war games and RPGs, and they're what allow you to visualize characters, environments, relative distance, like this
positionality.
Yes, exactly. And the more tactical your game is, the more important having that representation is.
Yeah.
And you don't need miniatures. You could play with like 25 millimeter circles with a little face drawn on it if you wanted, but there's something so evocative about having a hand painted model, something that's been like taken and assembled from the sprue, or, cleaned, had the mold lines cleaned off it if it was cast or whatever. Right. And taking that, assembling it, putting it together, maybe kit bashing, maybe not, maybe painting the model and having them on like a bespoke table laid out with terrain, not like a prescribed layout, you know what I mean, like a board game would have, but the ability to put the hill here today and maybe trees over here, and we'll put a bunker down here. And then my sci-fi troopers come from around the side of the hill and your aliens are hiding in the woods and the game is on. And they tell such elaborate stories, or they allow you to, in a way that's very different than theater of the mind. Because theater of the mind is all about narrative, right? And you really get these evocative tales that can deal with emotion and personality. But in a miniature story, why did the country B take over country A? Well, it's because country A's militia broke on the river and country B was able to push their grenadiers across. And you only know that because of the miniatures game. That would never come up in theater of the mind. But in the miniatures game, you know where the morale failed and who crossed that river to get the foothold on the other side, and how that developed the battle and changed the whole history of that nation, in a big battle game, for example. Or conversely, in a skirmish game, like you find out why like Rolf lost his hand and now has to have a shield strapped to his forearm. You know what I mean? Like you learn that story, and the miniatures gaming is so good for that. But the problems are like you need models, you need storage, you need terrain.
There's a storage component. There's a price component.
Yep.
There's a play space now that you have to take in. I mean, that also brings in like, well, what scale do you want, and what are the advantages and disadvantages? Generally speaking,
yes,
the bigger the model, the better it looks, but the more it reduces or abstracts your play space.
So like if you're using 28 mil models and you're trying to fight a big battle, you're abstracting the heck out of it, relative to using them in a skirmish game where you can be pretty one-to-one with things.
Yep.
Conversely, if you're using 15 mil or epic scale models, you could more easily depict larger battles. However, if you have to move those individual dudes around and know which one has the laser rifle to which one has the grenade launcher, it's harder to track.
Yeah.
Miniatures, like you have to be motivated to want to engage with them as a separate hobby for them to be worthwhile adding on to gaming. Like you can live a whole life as a gamer and never paint a model and have the richest RPG campaigns, the best board game battles, and never miss anything. But there's something special to be had when you have like a full Normandy tabletop with a whole village, and then you painted an entire platoon with armor support and you're fighting that battle. Like that is a height of gaming that I think miniatures allow for. That's really rewarding. And it's one of those things that some games necessitate and other games can benefit from. but they're not necessary. And you do got to take into account the baggage they bring with them.
Yeah, it's funny. I for the longest time, I was a mini skeptic. I was never super exposed to that. Like, obviously I was, my uncle played like like World War II battleship games.
Oh yeah.
So I was familiar with the materials, but I never really was shown how they were actually played. And yeah, generally I didn't really get into it until I met you. And then you converted my other friends into it before me.
Yeah, we got into historical gaming.
Yeah, and I was like, all right, you know what? After playing this and trying it, I'm like, you know what? There is a special kind of magic to miniatures.
There is something they do that's unique. And it's both like the hobby art side, the craft side that's really engaging and like gets your brain working. But just like having a guy and putting him on the corner and having him like hold that corner with his laser gun and he's just firing at the aliens running at him. Like that is a type of story in its own right that, again, the theater of the mind doesn't really touch on. Like you can for sure say in theater of the mind, like I take cover on the corner and blast him. But all that's really happening is you now have a cover modifier to your defense rolls. And perhaps there'll be an impediment to guys moving at you in some regard, but it's very abstract. And the miniature game makes it literal in a real way. Some more so than others. Like 40K is pretty abstract in the way it handles miniature placement and moving through ruins and things. But then if you look at Kill Team, the skirmish version of the 40K setting, like you're moving up ladders to go up walls. Like you're specifically engaging with the terrain on the table. So even within the same setting, different rule sets can really tackle the concepts of a miniature world differently. But they're super rewarding, and they kind of contrast heavily to games that take place on maps and boards. Like if you're playing like a board game, let's say you're still playing a war game, you're playing a tactical like advanced squad leader, right? You'll have a map and that'll be fixed. Like the map won't change. It's of course printed. So every time you do a battle on this battle space, this surface, it will have the same village, the same hills, the same roads and rivers. Maybe you'll start with different deployment conditions or different objectives, but ultimately you'll be doing mostly the same thing. And this can be countered by modular tiles or like 4 boards that you slide into one shared battle space, you know what I mean? So you can like move the quarters around. So there's different ways to counter this and stuff. Like if you think of Gloomhaven or Journeys in Middle-earth, those are 2 games that use modular board tiles to create like diverse layouts. But they are a little more fixed. Some prefer that in a sense because we come back to the dreaded word balance, where we must consider like maybe an ASL game is really good because the designers have play tested this map within an inch of its life and they know, no, it's actually really, really good that this river runs this specific hex pattern because it allows X and Y to occur for the defender. The attacker still has the advantage Z, but whatever. Like, you know what I mean?
You're just creating chess at that point.
True.
I don't think that's always sometimes the interesting thing is discovering the map. Like even if you're playing ASL, just to another point about like modular tiles, like there's Hexographer. You can make a hex encounter map whatever way you want. You can even randomly generate it and print it off and play it. Yeah, like modern day as far as like boards and maps go, or say you're doing hex encounters in Dungeons and Dragons. If you're doing a hex crawl, there's lots of tools where you can customize that. You don't have to spend months and months like drawing out. To be fair, those look really good. And, I've seen some decent art go into hex maps and dungeon maps, especially.
Yeah.
There's something to be said, though, about the type of D&D, as an example, the dungeon survival game, where the GM might have a map, but it's up to the players to make their own.
Yeah.
There's this sort of translation from real map to theater of the mind to then the other map.
And is it like a square by square map, or is it more just like a collection of loose notes and sketches? There can be different ways to do it, but you're right.
Like graph paper is sometimes, that's what I've seen the most. But yeah, sometimes it's just like you just determine with like squares and lines and naming things as far as what you think they are. And then the actual distances are not privy to you unless you jot them in. Like, oh, this corridor was 50 feet.
Yeah, unless you use tremor sense or something.
It depends on how much of the game you want to show, like how much of the wheels and gears you mind popping up in your game.
Well, like in a war game, you need, like, because it is so tactical or operational, you need the topography. The topography is the story. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of how that works. But in an RPG, you can still use gridded mats like dry erase or what am I trying to say? Laminated maps that you have, that you draw on. You can still use that.
Yep.
But in RPGs, there's also a lot of opportunities to not get so caught up in those details.
It's less specifically dependent on the representation of the terrain.
Yeah.
And it's more supposed to be kind of evocative. Like, it's important to note things of, if you're playing a tactical role-playing game, like something that has tactical decision-making in it, and that's quite a few of them, to be honest, you're going to at least want to make note or be open to the idea that things exist based on what you've established the setting to be. So if we're in a forest and I want to take cover behind a fallen tree, you don't have to tell me that tree's there. But if I ask if there's that, you certainly should be open to the idea, even if you're undecided on exactly how it works. That's one of the things that is so important about role-playing games as opposed to war games.
Yeah.
Is in role-playing games, you've got to ask questions.
You do.
You're going to be at a huge disadvantage if you don't. And asking questions is also, and if you run a game, you'll know this too, asking questions is also hinting at ideas. Doesn't mean you have to take them, but if the player's like, oh yeah, is there something I can jump behind, that's within range? You can say, no, but a little ways off, there's like a boulder that you could get behind. Or maybe, yes, there's a fallen tree right next to you, and you can jump down behind it.
That's a great example of using advantage or opportunity from the Star Wars or L5R dice, because you can use, like, without having a dedicated map, I could use my opportunity, like I rolled a hit, get success. Okay, I'll spend opportunity to take cover behind this fallen tree that's here. And it wasn't necessarily there, but it also wasn't not there.
Yeah, exactly. And there are even Oracle systems. I don't think we've really talked about Oracle systems, but
no, we should do an episode on Mythic though.
Yeah, that would be a good way to get into that. But there are systems where if you don't know, but you kind of know whether the probability and you don't want to make a decision about it, this is generally more of a solo game thing because not having control is more interesting in that situation than necessarily pulling something out on the fly.
Yes.
But it can be useful if you can't make a decision or you don't want to make a decision. I have my preferred Oracle system, but Mythic is a really good one. So yeah, we should definitely make an episode about that because it's basically a whole game system.
Yeah, you can play it as well as use it. I used it in a long-running Star Wars campaign, and it allowed for POV changes, like perspective changes, not like to change your player character, but to like throw the camera to the villain, which was very cinematic. Like that's what would happen in Star Wars, is it would cut to the bounty hunter arriving at the spaceport after you, seeing your ship. And we got those moments by using Mythic and rolling on those random event tables.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so cool. In every RPG I play, the first thing I think of is Mythic appropriate to add here? In a lot of cases, it might not be. There's a lot of games where you don't need it or it might not be the right fit. But it's really cool to be able to play on those elements. And like you said, in solo gaming, it is especially important. I'm a huge fan of 5 Parsecs and 5 Leagues by Modiphius and Ivan Sorensen.
Mm-hmm.
And those games kind of like have like table after table after table to walk you through in this sort of narrative process. But all of it is just for you to interpret as opposed to being like super bespoke, and like laid out for you.
Yeah, for sure. So then there's another point we can move on to, which are like tokens and counters. Now, this can apply to role-playing games. I can certainly think of a few where it's useful. Sometimes they're official, but in war games, I think it's more obvious where they're used.
Yeah, like tracking initiative can happen in a war game, right?
I think the best example of this, because it's so well integrated, is actually bolt action.
Okay, that's a good example.
Yeah, because when you pull, so the initiative, for those that don't know or haven't listened to us do that episode, Initiative is determined by 2 different colors of, we'll call them dice, but they're really markers. You don't roll them. And they're dumped into a bag or a box or whatever. And it's drawn like lots. And one player is one color and the other player is another color. And the nice thing about how these tokens work is not only do they tell you who's going, but on each side, it's a 6-sided die, each side have the 6 orders that you can give. And what you do is you turn it onto that face and you plant it next to that unit. And it does what I think is the most basic thing that tokens do in a war game, which is declare or indicate.
Yeah, 100%.
So declaring is, these guys have moved, or these guys are doing this. The nice thing about using the bolt action dice is that it not only tells you who's moved, but what they did.
Yeah, it's a really efficient activation marker as well as indicator of what has happened. And like I was explaining earlier, I use my Legion tokens, and I use my Surge token from Legion to be my activation marker because it's just like a green and white little square. So I just put it on the table next to my guys that have gone, and it's great. But in bolt action, it's so nice to be able to reference like, oh yeah, these guys advanced to this turn. These guys took a sprint. These guys, went down, like whatever it was. I do totally agree. I think it's a really elegant move. And I typically like a game that's not afraid of counters and tokens, but doesn't have a lot of stupid ones. Like that's the one thing I want to complain about, like sword weirdos and space weirdos. Do you know what I mean? Is like the footprint counter for how many actions you used on movement.
Oh.
I'm like, I don't like that one. That's like, I understand what it's doing in the game and it's a cool mechanical little flourish. But at the same time, it's just like, I don't have a readily proxiable token for that. And it's a little fiddly, Same thing with like TMM and BattleTech.
Oh,
where it's like, just use a dice. Don't use the tokens they give you in the Alpha Strike set. Like just use a die. It's way easier. Use a red die if they ran, use a white die if they walked, you know what I mean? Or if they jumped, I mean. But like simple as that.
Yeah. My rule of thumb is that if something needs to be indicated accumulatively more than one status, use a die.
Yeah.
As much as I really love the 2 Fat Lardies games and I love their shock mechanics and stuff like that, the shock markers are, this is my own personal opinion, they're atrocious. Just use a 6-sided die. Use 2 6-sided dies if it really gets that bad.
Yeah.
It's so much easier, especially because the game uses individually based units. Now, in all fairness, Rich and the people who play the way he does use 28 mils, and they're more abstractly representative. There's more bathtubing going on. But the way that Troy and I play are with 15 mil.
Yeah.
And we literally represent every hit on a unit, and the unit being like a squad with a guy. So when the shock markers make up as many of the actual units, you're moving a lot of stuff on the table and it just takes forever. But if you just have...
Yeah, you're moving like...
Yeah, I've got like tiny 1/4 inch, or I don't remember what the size are. They're really small D6s. Rich has talked about how bad his eyesight is, so I totally get it. It's a lot easier to see a bunch of things splayed out on a table. But while my eyes are still good, I insist on using the tiny dice.
Yeah, while I still can, I'm using the dice. Sometimes I'll even stick them in a little dice frame if I want to make sure I don't knock them over.
Sure.
But yeah, no, I agree. I think if you're tracking any value that goes above 3, like I don't mind having 3 pin markers on a guy. That's fine with me.
That's okay.
But like if you're doing like if you're playing the game Warcry, like the Age of Sigmar skirmish game, it's a great game, super fun.
Oh yeah.
But guys will have like 30 health. And I'm putting these little tokens down for like 5, 10, 15, 20. And it's like, no, that's stupid. Just put a die next to them.
Yeah.
It's so much better. I've tried using the cardboard tokens extensively because I have oh so very many of them. But I've just fallen back on using D10s because 1, I won't roll a D10 by accident because it's the wrong type of dice for the game. And 2, it just most of your basic, jobbers, they only go up to 10 anyways.
Yeah. RPG pro tip, everyone. Do not mark hit points onto your character sheet. Get a spin down D20 die.
Yeah.
I know for games that have like ridiculous hit point values, this is probably not the most practical after a while. If you don't know what spin down dice are, find someone who plays Magic the Gathering and ask them. No, I'm kidding. Spin down dice it's a D20 usually. It could be anything. But rather than, I don't know if you notice when you look at dice. So say it's got 20 on one side. On the opposite side, it'll have the 1. And every one of those will essentially take the total number of sides of the die, add 1 to it, and every opposite facing should add up to that value. So a d20 plus 1 is 21. So every time you look at one side and then turn it around and look at the other side, it should equal 21. Doesn't matter what facing you have, unless the dice were made badly. This is also a great tip if you play Dungeon Crawl Classics and you're not familiar with the dice. Find the 1, turn it over, that's the die you're holding. So it's like, which one's the D7? And you're like, okay, it's probably this. And then you find the 1, flip to the opposite side, bam, it's a 7. Perfect. Roll it.
Excellent.
Eventually you'll learn what those shapes are and you won't have to look, but that's a good tip. But spin down dice don't read like this. They read consecutively next to each other. So the nice thing is that you can use it like a counter that you put on your character sheet. And so you have 20 hit points, let's say, and you can see that the 19, rather than being on some distant side of the die, is actually just next to it. And you can just sort of tip the dice over gradually and work your way until you eventually get to the opposite side where the 1 is. It saves scratching on your sheet all the time, leaving like weird marks and erasing and all this other stuff. It's just nice to just go click and you're good to go. There's a lot of other ways to do it, I suppose.
Poker chips is classic.
Chips are good. One of the best ways that I played the Cypher system, Numenera, was I had 3 different colors. No, 4?
I think, oh yeah, right, because there's luck or whatever.
Or yeah, there's experience. But yeah, so that game uses stat pools, which are determined by a value that fluctuates. And then rather than erasing and rewriting the value on your character sheet, just dish out 3 different colored tokens, which are might, speed, and intellect. And then whenever somebody wants to use an ability or use effort or, push themselves harder, just expend some more tokens.
Yeah.
And you can see immediately who's rolling what based on how much you've got. It might be good to have a separate one for experience, which you can, in that game system, use kind of the way you use luck in other games.
Yes, exactly. You can spend it.
It's a fun system. It might be one of my favorite D20 systems. It works better for some genres than others, but you could effectively make it work for whatever.
Yeah. And another resource that's become popular in recent years with role-playing and miniature games is the rise of cards. These can be used to track characters, items, random events, all types of things. But card reference for miniatures games has become a huge thing in the last 5-10 years, wherein, sure, there might still be a codex or an army book or whatever, but they will either include in the box or sell you separately, of course, cards that have the unit's statistics on them. So if you're going to play, say you're going to play Legions Imperialis, that's a game with 1 million units that are very rich and detailed with a ton of weapon options. It's a super thematic game. But if you want to really get into it, you're cracking open like 4 different textbooks and looking up weapon stats, unless you have these cards. And they like drastically simplify the process of playing the game in terms of the lookup. And I think that's valuable. I mean, there are some games that they're simple enough you don't even really need to think about them. But there's a lot of games, especially the special power games, where like every unit has a different power up. It's kind of nice just to have a card to look at and be like, oh yeah, these guys get +1 defense if they're on an objective, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I honestly think it's weird that it's come so late that they've become a common thing.
Yeah.
Because people have been taking like note cards and writing all of their army stats or writing their unit stats for BattleTech. Like,
oh yeah, like since Rogue Trader, like that's been a thing. Like 2nd edition 40K is really well known for being like the recipe card era. Where you would like fill out all your units on these recipe cards, your index cards, and that would be like your army list. Would just be like, oh, here's my 8 cards, for my characters and my vehicles and my 2 squads, and here we go.
Yeah, classic BattleTech, same sort of thing. It's like, there's a lot of things I got to keep track. I mean, they use character sheets.
Yes, they do. 100%.
I'm sometimes skeptical of the efficiency of all the things on those sheets, because I think a lot of it's quick reference, and I don't know how quick it is, but that should give you some notion that like, yeah, some games are that heavy.
The other thing about cards that you got to keep in mind is that it's just another component you have to track. So it's like maybe you put them in sleeves, maybe you have a card box for them, but it's just another thing at the table to be mindful of, and also that you kind of want to be careful with because it probably cost you hard-earned money to get your hands on it. So part of me, like we've mentioned, with that sort of desire to cut down on things and kind of go minimalist, kind of wants to avoid all the extra stuff at the table and all the little bits and bobs I have to track and pay for and put in little protective sleeves and then put in little cabinets in my basement to look after my component. You know what I mean? There's a lot.
Sure.
It's just more stuff.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to actually play a game that has meaningfully complicated interactions or units, holy heck, these cards can be huge. Like, I bring up Legions Imperialis again just because you can have 7 different weapons that could be on a unit. Maybe they only have 1 or 2 equipped, but to just have that available to you instead of making your own Google Doc and typing all this nonsense in and printing it out and laminating that, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a cost, it's a convenience thing. Like time, like how much is your time worth relative to how much trouble is it keeping track of all this component junk? But it's really interesting. And yeah, you mentioned character sheets. Do character sheets count as like a GM handout? They kind of are, because you probably get them from your GM.
Yeah, I mean, they're a reference for sure. Actually, just a final point about cards in the way that they interact with role-playing games. Status effects.
Oh, good point.
Now, I'm annoyed sometimes when a role-playing game tries to codify cards too much, where like now it's a game of cards that use dice as well. And it's still, because I find that there's a tendency to become too mechanically strict. But one thing that I definitely appreciate if a game has complex status effects and the like is to have a deck of reference cards that the GM can, for lack of a better word and probably a more polite way to do, throw out at a player and be like, your leg's broke. You've been poisoned.
Yeah, exactly.
The nice thing about that, as opposed to say just putting it on your sheet, which we'll be getting to, you're going to see that card. It's going to loom on you. I've actually done it with Post-it notes, where I have like a Post-it note and I'll be like, poisoned, and then brief description of the effect, and then I'll like hand it to the player and they stick it on their sheet.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd like to see more official like supplements from systems that are reminders. They're not parts of the rules of the game. They're just good ways to indicate to players you've got such and such a thing. I know these exist, but I'd just like to see them a little bit more, especially for status complex games, you know, where there's a lot of status effects, wounds and things like that.
Just a tangent off that, I want to take a quick jump before we talk about GM handouts. So you're playing Star Wars Legion, and there's literally a token for every status effect. There's like over 25 different tokens in that game. So that's one way of resolving that. But say you're playing Warhammer Age of Sigmar. There are a million status effects, and there are no tokens. Like, there are so many status effects, like this unit gets a +1 once this has happened. This unit gets a -1 if they're in this condition. But there's no tokens.
So how do you indicate that?
You just roll with it. Like you're just like...
Jot it down.
You jot it down, or you have your unit cards, like we were talking about cards earlier, that like say on the card, like, if defending an objective, reroll armor saves. And then you can like show your opponent, like, oh, I'm on the objective, as you can see, so I get this. So like, it's kind of like that, but there are no tokens or status effects that you're marking on the table, aside from the very, very few times GW has provided like a punchboard cardboard sheet with an army book. But like, that's once in a blue moon they do that, and that usually only covers like I'm thinking of the 3rd edition Night Hunt book, where they came with like a couple cardboard circles that you would put on units that you charged that turn to know they're scared, and like that was it. So it's weird that some games will go so deep on the tokens and on the cards and on the requirements to track everything, like every reminder is present, to other games that are just like, figure it out, it's on you, man.
Yeah, sometimes I think it's funny, between recording episodes, we were talking about what I guess I'll call a studio game.
Yes.
I'm going to categorize this as a unique form of expert blindness, if anyone's familiar with that term.
Mm-hmm.
That's when someone is so expert at that thing or has such a particular advantage in playing or using or accessing that thing that they forget who it's for. And this doesn't happen that often, because thankfully there are like user testing and all this other stuff. But there's a few things that slip through where it's like, look, if you don't have a gigantic room in your house and at least 12 hours a day to play this game or can commit like massive amounts of regular time.
Yeah.
It's pretty much only it's a game designed for people who design games.
Yeah, a lot of GMT war games fall into that category where like, how do you have a 6 foot by 8 foot table to lay out a map?
Yeah.
Like, how do you do that in a regular person's life? It's crazy. But the games are rewarding and meaningful.
Charles Grant's Battle, right? The table?
Yes, exactly.
It's 9 feet by what?
Like, yeah, just out of control. You need a whole drawing room just to do that. And there are people that have that, right?
Some people are committed, right? Like some people have that.
Yeah.
But to go into the idea of indicating to players, yeah, so I guess the other thing you've got are GM screens.
Yeah.
These are useful. They're good references so that you don't have to flip through the book, obviously. So I would say that undoubtedly they are a useful thing. The idea of hiding your stuff from the players is, there's debates about that. I could go either way depending on the type of game. If it's just sort of like let's have fun and throw dice, the screen might actually be a hindrance because I want the players to see it's the dice outcome.
Yeah.
But in a game where if I'm playing like Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green or something like that, a big part of it is not knowing what's going on. The screen can be really helpful for creating that sense of tension.
Mm-hmm.
But the screen itself can have a lot of useful information, especially if you've got a really complicated game. I typically say that if the game is simple enough that it's just a fun and throw dice game, you probably don't even need that reference information.
Yeah.
Like I don't need a screen to play Troika.
No.
Right? Because half of it is just whatever we make up at the minute anyway.
100%. Well, another type of GM tool would be their like adventure handouts, I guess I'll call them. Do you know what I mean?
Props.
Props is way better.
Yeah.
Because like I'm in a massive Nyarlathotep campaign right now, no spoilers. And the handouts we're getting are from the Miskatonic Society, something like that. They're the people that produced the prop set for the game.
Yep.
And it is wild. Like the level of detail and, I hate the term, but immersion that you get from having like a newsprint newspaper that on one side is the story you're reading, and then on the other side it's like a fake baseball game from 1927.
Yeah,
it's wild the level of effort that's gone into that, and it's not necessary for a good role playing experience. But man, can they be cool! Like in Nyarlathotep, I got a handout that is like a psychiatric file of a guy, and it's like 30 pages, and you do not need to read all of it. You kind of can skim it, but it's so wild that that level of thought and detail has been put into this, and it adds a lot of character. If you're just like a home GM, like, yeah, right, you're going to do that yourself for the most part, but it's cool when you are engaging with published materials and adventures that these can be really helpful. Like, I think it's a big Call of Cthulhu thing.
Oh, 100%.
You know, more than many other games.
Yeah.
To rely on these.
Yeah. Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green, any of those sort of deep investigational games.
Gumshoe, right?
Yep. Gumshoe can definitely benefit from that because we're going through the advantages and drawbacks on a lot of these things. Here's one of the drawbacks, and this is actually more from Troy, one of your experiences, which is the Free League Blade Runner game.
Yes.
It does everything that it's supposed to do, right? Like, so you actually get these amazing breakdowns of like images, and you can actually like enhance parts of them.
Yeah.
And there'll be another image and it works really good as this handout that players can kind of investigate and explore in a really, really cool way. The downside to this is now a core part of the game has been established around these materials. So what if you want to make your own thing? How long is that? Even if you have, say, even the artistic ability or anything like that, like how long is it going to take to do that? Like how much effort do you want to put in? Because your game is established to run on these materials. And that was my big criticism with the Blade Runner game was I'm like, yeah, this is a cool rule system. It's really evocative of the world. It feels like Blade Runner in a way that like any other attempt or pastiche of it hasn't really come close. And yet this is true of a lot of Free League things is like, I think their designs are amazing, but they have this ceiling on them that you don't see until you start getting a little further into it. And you realize, wait, I can't do that.
Yes.
Wait a minute, this skill only goes up to this far. I'm going to max my character out pretty soon, right? Like, again, no shade. I love those games. Free League is like one of my favorite role-playing companies, but there is an intentionality to proprietary game materials that bugs me so much.
I absolutely know what you mean. That's really interesting because like one of the things in that Blade Runner game is you don't just make a search check. You're handed a photo and you point to things on the photo.
Yeah.
And the GM will tell you what they mean. Like it's the search check is you. You are the search check.
Yep.
Which is so cool. I love that. It was really evocative at the table. But exactly as you've explained, how does one make their own adventure for that?
Yeah, I mean, you might have to just forgo that and come up with some other...
The search check is back.
Yeah, right? It's a cool idea, but I think it then restrains the game to being more board game-like, which I think is... The relationship between role-playing games and board games is always a contentious one, because board games have very, very contained scope.
Yes.
And role-playing games promise something more than that. Sometimes those mixing of ideas really helps build the efficiency into the thing. It can make games more streamlined. It can make dice systems more meaningful. But in some ways, it also means that you're now tied to these extra things that you've brought in. And your imagination can't stretch out from that. So yeah, that's our little episode on game components. Any kind of final thoughts? Anything you want to kind of like ramble down?
I'm someone who started off not liking components. I thought they were messy and they made my table look bad when I liked having the models and the terrain be the focus. But the more I've gamed, the more that I have come to find that I want a smart assortment of tokens of a high quality that I can reuse across multiple games. So I've cannibalized, other games to create my token set of choice that I can use across all these indie games that don't have the budget to make their own tokens.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
And that to me it's been really satisfying being able to do that and use those parts. I try to play things off my phone as much as I can, like, from a PDF or from a Google Doc file. But again, playing games like Warcry or Legion Imperialis or whatever with those cards, they speed it up. They make it nice. Do I want to go out of my way and buy every card set for every faction I'm interested in? No way. That's crazy. But every once in a while for a core team I'm going to play, like if I'm going, like I'm in a league right now and I'm sort of debating, like, do I get these cards for my Thousand Suns for this league? Because it'll just be so much, like, it's easier to show someone else my rules. I don't have to like stick my phone in their face. I can just like give them a card and be like, yo, this is how my sorcerer works if you want to read it. So there's a lot of value to components. If you want to play, like a lot of the RPGs I play are like Google Drive docs, no character sheets, dice rolls to show you on a camera, not even in a VTT. So you can get as minimal as you want and you can still have a fantastic experience. But at the end of the day, if you find the right balance for your miniatures, your tokens, your components, you can enrich and enhance your experience.
100%. And I think an episode that'll definitely be in the pipeline is VTTs, and we can have a whole other conversation about how useful those are in this same context.
Yes, the VTT I really want to try is I want to try Roll20 integrated into Discord because it just might be the least messing about. But I haven't tried it, so I want to get in on that and see how much of it is a walled garden, pay-your-way ecosystem relative to like more of a sandbox. I'm not sure.
Sure, yeah.
But the fact that like everyone's got Discord, so it should be pretty easy to use that as opposed to the trouble of, okay, get it on Steam, install it. You have to create a login on their company website. Then you can sign in with that into Steam. I'm looking at you, Fantasy Grounds. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, there's a lot of stuff that goes into some BTTs. So yeah, let's break that down and talk about it because it'd be really, really fun.
Yeah. All right. What do we got coming up?
Oh, our next week is actually a game that we played years ago. We did quite a cool campaign. We're talking about Numenera.
Yep.
So this is the Cypher system, D20, Monty Cook, lots to like. Is Numenera the best version of Cypher? That's what we'll talk about, perhaps. But it is certainly a super cool game with a lot of flavor and a very Dying Earth feeling if you're into that.
Yeah, totally. And it's a unique setting. Until then, happy gaming and have fun.
Have a good one.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.